네, good morning. 오늘 아침 찬송 369장 같이 부르겠습니다. This morning we will be singing hymn number 369.
그
오늘 아침 말씀은 누가복음 18장 1절부터 8절까지 보겠습니다. This morning we'll be looking at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. And I'll read this for us this morning. It says, Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, Grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And so this morning, we will continue our devotion series in the Gospel of Luke by looking at the first passage of Luke chapter 18. The passage that we just read is known as the parable of the persistent widow, and although it is relatively short compared to other longer parables, there is a significant lesson here that Jesus is trying to teach. And if not careful, there are some mistakes and misinterpretations that can be made. So this morning, we'll be looking at what Jesus is trying to teach about prayer, how we ought to pray, and who we are praying to. Jesus was teaching these things to his disciples, and all of it is relevant even for us today. And so point number one for this morning is that the phrase always pray does not necessarily mean to be in constant active prayer, but to always be in the spirit of prayer. 항상 기도하라는 소리는 말 그대로 기도만 하라는 것이 아니라 항상 기도의 자세를 가지라는 뜻입니다. Once again, the phrase always pray does not necessarily mean to be in constant active prayer, but to always be in the spirit of prayer. 항상 기도하라는 소리는 말 그대로 기도만 하라는 것이 아니라 항상 기도의 자세를 가지라는 뜻입니다. And so in verse 1, Luke writes that Jesus was telling his disciples in this parable to always pray and to not give up. It would make sense that Luke is including this parable and writing about it, since the same concept was taught later on by his close companion, the Apostle Paul. In Paul's first letter to the church of Thessalonica, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17, he also uses the phrase, pray without ceasing. Now, when both Jesus and Paul are saying this, some people may be overwhelmed and may think it is impossible. In a way, they are right, since no one is really able to continuously pray every single moment of their life. A person may be able to pray for minutes, maybe even for hours. And there are also some reports about where some devout religious people prayed or meditated for a number of days. But no one in history will be able to actively and constantly be in prayer at all times. So what is Jesus and Paul trying to say, as it seems like they are giving us an impossible task? Both Jesus and Paul are saying that we must always be in the spirit of prayer, or in other words, to always be open and have a desire to pray. It is not by coincidence that Jesus is telling this parable about being fervent in prayer, since if you look back at yesterday's devotion and chapter, Jesus had just talked about the coming of the kingdom of God and the Son of Man's return. Jesus knew that challenging times would come for his disciples, as he even said that he himself had to suffer and be killed, and so he didn't want his disciples to lose heart and to give up and to stop praying. And that would even apply to when he would later ascend into heaven and promise that he would come back. Jesus did not want his disciples to lose hope and to stop praying, thinking that Jesus would not return again. Going back to Paul's letter in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where he talks about praying without ceasing, Paul is also encouraging the believers in Thessalonica to keep praying and to not give hope, especially in the midst of persecution. Paul had also talked about the coming of the Lord in the same chapter to encourage the believers to not give up hope and to keep praying. There are many reasons why people would want to give up and not continue to pray. Number one, they may not sincerely believe in the power of prayer. Number two, the answer or response is not what the person expected or wanted. And number three, there are many distractions that keep us from praying. These are all things that Jesus taught and warned us about in Matthew chapter 6 when he taught us how to pray with the Lord's Prayer. It says in the Lord's Prayer that his will be done, not ours, and that we ask not to be led into temptation. Jesus also said that we shouldn't be hypocritical or just babble on when praying. The sincerity of the prayer is more important than the longevity of the prayer. Is praying to God a priority in our lives, or does it become simply a last resort? This leads to my second point for this morning. Point number 2 is if even an unjust judge listens, our Father in heaven will listen even more. 불의한 재판관도 듣는다면 하늘에 계신 아버지는 더 들으십니다. Once again, if even an unjust judge listens, our Father in heaven will listen even more. 불의한 재판관도 듣는다면 하늘에 계신 아버지는 더 들으십니다. So we see in verses 2 to 5 that Jesus then tells the actual parable of the persistent widow. The widow kept coming to the judge asking for justice against her adversary. Someone may have cheated and wronged her, and so she wanted the judge to do something. For some reason, the widow kept coming back and asking for help, which means the judge probably didn't listen to her or take her case seriously. But finally, in verse 5, we see that the judge finally gives in to the widow's request due to her persistence. If not careful, some people may misunderstand and misinterpret this parable by simply saying, we must be persistent in prayer because God is like this judge who will finally listen to our pleas. Yes, the parable is focusing on the idea of being faithful in prayer, as we looked at earlier in point number 1, but it is important to look at the reasons why, since God is actually quite different from this judge. In verse 2, it says that this judge neither feared God nor cared about what people thought about him. It also says in verse 6 that the judge was also unjust. The only reason this judge finally listened to the widow was for his own benefit, as he didn't want to be bothered by her any longer and was afraid that she would attack him if he didn't do anything, as it says in verse 5. God is actually quite different in the reasons why we should keep praying to him. God is righteous, fair, and just when he answers prayers, unlike this judge. God desires a personal relationship with us instead of it just being a legal obligation. Unlike the judge, God looks out for our interests instead of just his own. These are all the right reasons why we should pray to our Father in heaven. We should not think that we are bothering God with our prayers, but instead drawing closer to him by praying to him. The point that Jesus is trying to make is that if even someone like this unjust judge is willing to listen to the pleas of this widow, how much more will our Father in heaven listen to our prayers? It is not because God has to listen to us. It is because he wants to listen to us. We also see here that the judge was reluctant to listen to the widow and listen to her case, which is why it took him a while to finally listen. At times, it may seem like God is also reluctant to our prayers and how he answers them and how long it takes to see the prayers answered. But we know that the concept of time is different to God than to us humans. In Psalm chapter 90, verse 4, and 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, it says that 1,000 years is like a day to God. So what may seem like a reluctance of God listening and answering our prayers is actually more of a delay and just taking some time. In the case of the judge in this parable, he purposely was reluctant in listening to the widow, hoping that she would give up and stop coming. On the other hand, God may be taking his time in answering our prayers in order that the best solution can be given at the best time. Judges in this world are like this one in this parable, do not always have the best solution and are in the best interest of others. This is quite evident in the justice system today around the world, as there are many trials and cases that are not dealt with properly. It was the same back then when Jesus is telling this to his disciples. The time of having judges of Israel had come to an end, and so now mostly the elders of the tribes were the ones who made decisions when cases were brought before them. That would mean that the unjust judge that Jesus could be possibly talking about is actually a Roman or Gentile judge who would be more biased, more uncaring, and more negligent towards the Jews who brought their cases before him. That just emphasizes even more how someone like that would eventually help. So how much more will someone like our God, our Father in heaven, listen and help us? So let us make sure that we do not just rely upon judges and rulers of this earth, but to always turn to God for help and guidance. And point number 3 for this morning is that perseverance in prayer is a sign of faithfulness in God. 기도 중인에는 하나님을 한양 믿음을 보여줍니다. Once again, perseverance in prayer is a sign of faithfulness in God. 기도 중인에는 하나님을 한양 믿음을 보여줍니다. In verse 7, Jesus says that God will bring justice to those who cry out to him day and night. Once again, it is not saying that we need to be praying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but that we are always turning to him and are spending time with him in prayer. Then in verse 8, Jesus says that God will see that they will all get justice quickly when that time comes. Jesus ends this parable with a question of, however, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? In other words, when he returns, will he find people who still believe and practice the first 2 points that we covered today? People who will always be in the spirit of prayer by trusting and turning him in prayer. Only those who really have faith in God will continue to persevere and be persistent in their prayers. Unfortunately, there are some who will never acknowledge and believe in God, and there will also be those who fall short and give up, as this parable is talking about. This is what Jesus, as well as other writers like Paul, are warning us about, that we do not fall away or turn away from our faith in God. A person's prayer life can be a direct reflection and one way to see how a person's spiritual walk with God is. Being rooted in his word and being fervent in prayer is what will empower us to remain faithful to the end. Jesus not only practiced this himself, as many times throughout the gospel, he withdrew from the people and spent time in prayer. He even asked before the crucifixion if the cup could be taken from him, asking if he really had to go through this, knowing what kind of pain and suffering it would bring. But just as Christ was empowered by prayer and remained faithful and obedient until the end, he is telling his disciples, and even you and I today, to remain steadfast and to persevere no matter what challenges and difficulties come our way. Paul continues on with this idea in many of his letters, like the one he wrote to Timothy, of how we have to fight the good fight until the very end. So let us persevere in our prayer life, even when we don't feel like it or when it seems like there is no answer. What is impossible with man can be made possible with God, and it will all be worth it when we are with him in heaven for eternity. And so in conclusion for this morning, let us remember that the phrase always pray does not necessarily mean to be in constant active prayer, but to always be in the spirit of prayer. Let us also remember that if even an unjust judge listens, our Father in heaven will listen to us even more. Lastly, let us remember that perseverance and persistence in prayer is a sign of faithfulness in God. And so at this time, if we meditate upon the word that we looked at today, if we can also practice and spend some time in prayer, let us pray.